Okay, here's Julius Caesar again. As I mentioned, he was Marius's nephew by marriage and had a pedigree which ran all the way back to Aeneas, and thanks to the gods themselves, since Aeneas' father Anchises was the only mortal ever to have had the honor of making love to the mother of Aeneas, Venus, the goddess of love herself. So his family was patrician, though far from among the wealthiest. He was, however, well-educated, well-mannered, and had a talent for ingratiating himself with the wealthy and powerful. This despite the fact that early on he attached himself to the more liberal political side and even married the daughter of Cinna, who had been one of the closest associates of Marius. In 68, Caesar was elected quaestor, something like assessor, and assigned to Spain. But since an army was required to collect taxes there, he did acquire some valuable military experience in this. In 65, he was elected aedile, something like Commissioner of Public Works. And in 59, with the support of Crassus, the Rockefeller of Rome, and Pompey, the great general, newly returned from triumphs in the East, including the subjection of Judea, he was elected consul. Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey are sometimes called the First Triumvirate, each agreeing to look out for the interests of the other. Although Marius served as consul 4 years in a row, according to Rome's unwritten constitution, a consul served for 1 year and couldn't succeed himself. By Caesar's day, ex-consuls as well as ex-praetors, censors, and other ex-holders of high offices made up the Senate. The senators were not elected. The Senate was technically only an advisory body, but it was very influential, and the Comitia Tributa, the closest thing to a popular legislative assembly in Rome, rarely went against its advice. In any case, Caesar didn't want to become just another politician, so when his term of office approached its end in 58, he had himself, in effect, appointed proconsul or governor of Gaul, what we call France, and spent the next 6 years bringing it under Roman control. By 58, the Romans had established a considerable presence in what they were to call Gallia Narbonensis, or the province, more or less what we call Provence, but their influence did not extend very far beyond that. By the 1st century, the Gauls themselves were far from wild hunter-gatherers. Most were engaged in farming, and there were many large settlements. The eventual success of the Romans is indicated on this map by the former Latin names of most of France's great cities. For example, the Romans called Paris Lutetia, which means Mudville. The main reason for the success of the Romans was Caesar himself. But though the Gauls didn't have Caesar, they did have Vercingetorix, of whom this is a modern statue where the major Gallic settlement at Alesia once stood. He was Caesar's most able opponent, and you can, of course, read about him and the whole campaign in Gaul in Caesar's own words in De Bello Gallico, one of the most interesting things ever written by a Latin author. Like Xenophon's Anabasis, it's almost like an account of a visit to another planet, so different is modern France from the Gaul of Caesar's day. But it's not wrong to say that France became the center of medieval civilization because it was the first country north of the Alps to be conquered by Rome. Caesar crossed the Rhine in 55 and crossed the Channel to Britain in 55 and again in 54, but the Romans would make no permanent establishment in Britain for another century and had few successes east of the Rhine, which came to be regarded as the de facto boundary of civilization. The climax of Caesar's campaign in Gaul came in 52. He besieged Avaricum, modern Bourges, south of Paris, and held off Vercingetorix's attempts to relieve it. In this model, you can see a Roman siege tower in action, and siege warfare was something at which the Romans excelled more than any other people of antiquity. They would go to any lengths to take a place and hold on with the tenacity of pit bulls until it surrendered. Their almost invariable success at this, and their general success in war as well, was to a large extent a product of their mastery of military technology. Their ability to build bridges, roads, and siege equipment like this left few places for an enemy to hide in safety. After the fall of Avaricum, Caesar was, however, unsuccessful in his attempt to capture Vercingetorix at Gergovia near modern Clermont-Ferrand, his only real failure in Gaul. But he surrounded Vercingetorix again at Alesia in the final major siege of the campaign. This is the way the hill of Alesia, modern Alise-Saint-Ouen, northwest of Dijon and Burgundy, looks today. The Romans built a double wall 20 miles long around the place to protect themselves from attacks either by Gauls attempting to relieve the siege or by sorties from Alesia itself until they were ready for an assault. In this diagram, you can see what this arrangement was like. After the Romans repulsed a massive attempt from outside to relieve Vercingetorix, the latter surrendered on condition that the place be spared. It was, but all the men were sold into slavery. Vercingetorix himself was hauled off to Rome, displayed as a trophy in Caesar's triumphal parade, and then executed. The political arrangement which Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey had made had meanwhile fallen apart. Crassus had died, leaving the ambitious Pompey the only one of the three in Rome, and Pompey's wife, who was Caesar's daughter, had also died, cutting another tie to him. The upshot of the complex maneuvering between 52 and 49 BC was that Pompey managed to have himself declared consul without colleague, essentially dictator, and he was then able to get the Senate to back him in requiring Caesar to return to Rome without his army. Caesar was, of course, planning to return, but not as some kind of private citizen. As Caesar approached the Rubicon River, considered the boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy, the situation in Rome became chaotic, with Caesar's and Pompey's supporters fighting in the streets. Negotiations came to nothing, and on January 10, 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his army, saying as he did so, "The dice are thrown, iacta est alea." Ironically, no one is certain what river the Romans called the Rubicon. There's a small river in eastern Italy called the Rubicone today, but it doesn't seem that this could have been the Rubicon he crossed on this occasion. In any case, Pompey, a great general in his own right, but no match for one of the greatest in history, fled to Greece with an army larger than Caesar's, but one the loyalty and ability of which he did not entirely trust. This is a portrait of Pompey now. When Caesar arrived unopposed in Rome, he behaved with not altogether expected clemency, although clemency toward his fellow Romans, even pretty serious political enemies, was not unusual for him. In any case, on this occasion, it won many fence-sitters to his side. After spending the summer subduing Pompey's supporters in Spain, he turned east to face Pompey himself, who was ensconced in the fortified town of Dyrrachium, in what's now Albania. After an epic campaign, Caesar was unable to drive him out and retreated into Greece. Pompey, faced with making the decision whether to gamble on returning to Rome and leave Caesar on the loose or to follow him, decided on the latter course, and at Pharsalia on August 9, 48 BC, the climactic battle of this civil war was fought. Though outnumbered 2-1, Caesar's forces routed Pompey's, and Caesar ate Pompey's dinner in the latter's tent after the battle. Pompey himself escaped to Egypt. When Caesar arrived in pursuit, he was presented with his head by Egyptians who had killed him. Rome was already essentially in control of Egypt, but Caesar found himself in trouble there nevertheless. King Ptolemy Auletes had willed his throne jointly to his son and the latter's older sister, Cleopatra. This precipitated a war between their supporters, in which, to make a long story short, Caesar took the side of Cleopatra and wound up besieged in the royal palace. Reinforcements arrived and they were rescued, but while his enemies grew stronger and his soldiers grew impatient, he dallied nearly a year with the 21-year-old queen. Finally, he arranged to have Cleopatra taken to Rome, nominally to negotiate a treaty, while he returned by Asia Minor, where he defeated the rebel Pharnaces at the Battle of Zela, made famous by the laconic message he sent announcing his victory to the Senate. Weeny weedy weeky. I came, I saw, I conquered. bust of Caesar now in the Vatican Museum. How his wife Calpurnia reacted to the arrival of Cleopatra, who was given a villa on the Janiculum Hill, isn't known, but soon after his own return to Rome, he left again to battle diehard supporters of Pompey in Spain and Africa, before coming back to Rome for the last time in October of 45, with just 6 months to live. Although most people associate Caesar with Rome at its height, very little of the city he knew, or of Republican Rome in general, survives above ground. Among the oldest things in Rome which we can regard as the remains of Republican buildings are the 4 foundations in what is known as the Aria, or Largo Argentina, off the Via Vittorio Emanuele. The one second from the left is thought to be the oldest and may go back as far as 400 BC, but it is not known to whom or what it or any of the others was originally dedicated. More impressive are the 2 buildings known as the Temple of Vesta and the Temple of Fortuna, more or less between the Forum and the Tiber. Of the 2, the Temple of Fortuna, which was probably actually dedicated to Portunus, the god of harbors, is the older, and was probably built around 200 BC, making it perhaps the oldest real building in the city. It has Ionic columns, a real rarity in a Roman building. The so-called Temple of Vesta was probably built near the end of Caesar's life, or perhaps after his death. It has the oldest Corinthian columns, the Roman favorites, surviving in the city. Caesar himself undertook the building of what was to be known as the Forum of Caesar, next to the Forum Romanum, the Forum. Some columns of the Temple of Venus, which was part of this forum, have been re-erected there, which Caesar might recognize today. Remember, Venus was very important to the Romans in general as the mother of Aeneas, the founder of Roman civilization, and to Caesar personally as his own supposed distant ancestor. The word forum itself is of uncertain origin, but the Forum Romanum was originally a marketplace. By Caesar's day, however, it was more of a center of business and government than a place to buy pigs and chickens. Caesar's Forum was the first of several satellite forums which were built adjacent to the original Forum Romanum itself. The Basilica Julia in the Forum was also built on his orders, but he didn't live to see it finished, and only the foundation of it survives as you see it now. A basilica was essentially a big covered space like a hall. Basilicas were often used for trials or other legal or government business that required such a place. Roman law is too complex a subject to do justice to in a lecture like this, and the great codifications on which its reputation is really based are later imperial achievements, but all Roman citizens, and Caesar extended citizenship to essentially all adult males in Italy, had certain rights, the most important of which was simply the right to claim the honor of being a Roman. The right to vote was valued, but the wealthy so dominated the election system, both constitutionally and by bribery, that it would certainly be misleading to regard Rome as a democracy. More important to the average citizen was the fact that he was exempt from taxes. Rome was supported by taxes on and loot from those territories of non-citizens which it conquered. This is a coin with Caesar's image on it, and coin portraits are often considered to have the best likenesses. There were many in Rome who were not unreasonably concerned about Caesar's ultimate ambitions, and when the Senate declared him Dictator Perpetuo in February of 44 BC, their fears seemed to have been justified. What was the difference, they wondered, between being perpetual dictator and being Rex, that is, king? Both Caius Cassius, the man usually said to have been the instigator of the assassination plot against Caesar, and Marcus Brutus had in fact fought on Pompey's side and been pardoned by Caesar after the Battle of Pharsalia. They were in fact not only pardoned but given prominent political posts as provincial governors. The only explanation for their action seems to be that they were just paranoid in their fear of the threat Caesar presented to the Republic, moribund though it seems in retrospect to have been anyway. Just west of the Largo Argentina we saw earlier, you see here the site of the theater which Pompey had built, parts of which stood in ruins until as late as the 18th century. When these ruins were finally removed and replaced by a street, it followed, as you can see, the curved line of the old theater. By Caesar's day, the Senate was too large to meet in any of the forum buildings and had begun meeting in this theater. So it was to this that Caesar came on March 15th, the Ides of March 44 BC, where it was expected by many that the proposal to have him crowned king would be raised. You know what happened. Cassius, Brutus, and the other conspirators stabbed him to death as or soon after he entered the building. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, who had long been one of Caesar's most trusted generals and who had been his magister equites, literally master of the cavalry but signifying second in command to a dictator, presided over the burning of Caesar's body, where the core of the altar raised on the spot in the forum still stands in front of the ruins of the temple later dedicated to Caesar as a god. Cassius and Brutus fled to Greece to try to gather support for their cause, since it soon became clear that in Rome they were not going to be regarded as the savior of the people. It is not surprising that Antony just assumed control of the army and the state would fall to him, especially given his tendency to overestimate his own ability, and he seems to have completely disregarded any threat that might have been posed by Caesar's own 18-year-old adopted heir, Octavius, the grandson of his sister. This is a coined portrait of Octavius, known by that name or as Octavian, until he was given the title Augustus by the Senate. Whatever you want to call him, his rise to power is one of the most amazing in history. He had never really been in a battle, never held political office, and was only a teenager. He had, however, the kind of genius his great-uncle had had, and which only history's most successful leaders have possessed. To whatever sources or causes you want to ascribe this power, the bottom line is that people who have it can get other people to do what they want. One should not underestimate the importance of his blood connection to Caesar either. The Romans had professed to detest the very idea of hereditary succession, hereditary monarchy, for 500 years, and yet one gets the feeling that the almost instinctive pull of that principle, which had been suppressed but not eradicated, and which is not unknown even today, was his biggest single advantage. A great part of the army, to the amazement of Antony, declared its allegiance to Octavian, and with the support of Cicero, whose Philippics against Antony made the latter look ridiculous, the Senate added its allegiance. The result was the defeat of Antony's army by Octavian at Modena. This was followed by negotiations which led to the formation of an uneasy alliance among Octavian, Antony, and a less consequential fellow named Lepidus, whom Shakespeare described as an unmeritable fellow meet to be sent on errands. They agreed that anyone which any of the three should name as an enemy could be eliminated, which let loose a reign of terror the like of which had rarely been seen in Rome. Cicero, who had made a fool of Antony, was on the top of the latter's list and was caught and decapitated. At the top of Octavian's list were Cassius and Brutus, and in 42 BC, the Second Triumvirate, as Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus are called, took its army into Greece to find them. And the upshot of this was the Battle of Philippi, fought near the city established 350 years earlier by the father of Alexander the Great. The army of Brutus pushed the wing of the triumvirs under Octavian back, but Antony overpowered Cassius and went on to defeat Brutus as well. Cassius and Brutus, the latter called the noblest Roman of them all by Shakespeare's Antony, because he thought he sought no personal gain by the assassination of Caesar, committed suicide. The Temple of Mars Ultor, the Avenger, was built by Octavian in commemoration of this victory, and a large part of it still stands beside the Via dei Fori Imperiali in Rome, which Mussolini laid out right over the top of some of the most important archaeological sites in the city. Apparently a project is actually underway to prop up the street and dig under it, but I'm not sure how far along that's gotten. The triumvirs now divided Rome among themselves. The empire, that is. Lepidus got Africa, west of Egypt. Octavian got essentially what was west of the Adriatic. Antony took the east, including Greece and Egypt. Lepidus soon lost his share to Octavian, however, and lived the rest of his life under surveillance in a villa near Naples. This is a portrait of Antony, and if any statue ever looked like it was wearing a wig, this is it. Shakespeare calls him a reveler and a shrewd contriver, though most ancient authorities don't seem to have thought he was very bright. Cicero, regardless of whether he really believed he was stupid or not, called him every synonym for that in the Latin language, so it's not surprising that Antony had his head cut off. He met Cleopatra at Tarsus in 41. The stated purpose of this meeting was political business, but as Shakespeare puts it, age had not staled nor custom dulled her infinite variety, and I would hope not, since she was only about 27. And Antony accompanied her then to Alexandria, where they apparently remained for some time as lovers, although after he left, he seems to have made no attempt to see her again for several years. Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia the next year, 40 BC, in a purely political arrangement, but after a couple of years of something like domesticity, he set off on an adventure into Anatolia and Armenia that achieved little, and then celebrated a triumph not in Rome with his wife, but in Alexandria with Cleopatra. In 32, he announced his divorce from Octavia and married Cleopatra, which he knew meant relations with Octavia's brother Octavian would reach an all-time low. Antony's claim that if he were supported by them, he would liberate the eastern provinces from Rome, brought him some help, and he and Cleopatra were able to put together one of the largest fleets ever assembled in the ancient world, as many as 500 ships, including transports for 100,000 men and 12,000 horses. Octavian's longtime friend, Marcus Agrippa, was put in charge of raising a force to defend Italy from this armada. In 31 BC, the two fleets met at Actium off the west coast of Greece. Although Antony and Cleopatra had Agrippa heavily outnumbered, they don't seem to have been very confident and had put much thought into plans for a retreat, which they needed, because Agrippa's superior tactical skill and more maneuverable ships won the day.
In the Nile Valley at Dendra, you can see a portrait of Cleopatra with her son by Julius Caesar, Caesarion.
She and Antony fled back to Alexandria, where they quarreled and separated, each trying desperately to make some deal with Octavian, who was fast approaching. The truth about their ends is inextricably wound up with fantasy and romantic legend. Antony apparently did kill himself, but whether this was because he thought she had is not clear. The traditional view is that, fearing imprisonment or worse from Octavian, she herself committed suicide after the latter's arrival. The main source for the more romantic details is Suetonius, sort of the Roman equivalent to a tabloid journalist, but even the tabloids occasionally tell the truth, so who knows? It's dangerous to assume that history is only true if it seems likely. This is the so-called Augustus of Prima Porta, the most impressive surviving image of Octavian, who was to become Augustus when he was given that title by the Senate in 27 BC. It was found in the ruins of an imperial villa a few miles north of Rome. The names of very few Roman sculptors can be connected to specific works. Certainly very few were signed, and Jansen mentions no sculptor by name in his entire treatment of Roman art. The usual view is that Roman work is distinctly inferior to that of the Greeks, which heavily influenced it. Still, I'd bet Augustus thought this was worth the money. It's not meant to just show you what he looked like. It's in effect a piece of propaganda, the point of which was to say, more or less, Augustus is terrific. As sculptors, the Romans are usually said to have done their best work in portraiture and are especially known for relatively unvarnished realism, but this has to be considered pretty well varnished, I think, even given that Augustus was a powerful presence in person and a fit subject for one of the most impressive Roman accomplishments in any medium. The period of his rule is sometimes called the Principate because he was also designated Princeps Senatus, or as Durant translates it, first on the roll call of the Senate. This word princeps is the root of our word prince. He also kept his army title imperator, or commander, which would soon become emperor. I'm not going to detail the character of his government. The essence of it is that he kept the institutions of the republic but had veto power over anything he didn't like, since he had the loyalty of 30 legions. And since he was, on the whole, a wise man, this was good, not bad. Art historians often consider the so-called Ara Pacis, or Altar of Peace, the chief artistic accomplishment of the reign of Augustus, of his era. Some would say of the whole of Roman sculpture, and you see it now as it's displayed in its own building beside the Tiber after having been extricated from under a later building in a truly amazing piece of archaeological engineering. The reliefs depict in essence a procession in honor of peace and plenty, and many of the figures in the work are apparently portraits of important people. The heavily damaged figure at the far left, more or less at the head of the parade, is thought to be Augustus himself, and at the far right is Agrippa, his longtime friend and the hero of Actium, who married, in fact, Augustus's daughter. In this detail, Agrippa is now at the far left. He wears a veil over his head because he was Pontifex Maximus, or head of the Roman state religion. The word Pontifex is the origin of the word pontiff. His son Gaius is to the right, and to the right of Gaius is his mother Julia, Augustus's daughter by his first wife, and next on the right is Livia, Augustus's second wife of dubious virtue. Antonia, the younger daughter of Mark Antony, looks right toward her husband Nero Claudius Drusus. They are the parents of Claudius, the grandparents of Caligula, and the great-grandparents of Nero. The last woman in the group to the right is Mark Antony's older daughter, called Antonia Major, with her children. To the right of her, with only his head showing in profile, is Maecenas, the famous philanthropist and friend and supporter of Virgil and Horace. At the far right is Anabarbus, the husband of Antonia Major. As I said, Roman sculptors are generally considered to have been at their best doing portraits, like those in the Ara Pacis, and here's another, this time anonymous subject, probably posing with busts of his father and grandfather. Just as the Ara Pacis is perhaps the greatest Roman work in the visual arts, so is the greatest single work of Roman literature, Virgil's Aeneid, also a product of the reign of Augustus. Virgil himself was born the son of a poor farmer in northern Italy, but somehow acquired a good education and fluency in Greek. His career is a good example of how talent can rise to the top, even in very difficult circumstances. We know little of his private life, except that he never married, and after the wealthy Maecenas became his sponsor, he was able to devote essentially his whole career to writing poetry. Like Augustus, whom he could also count on as a friend, he admired the heroic Roman past very much, and with it the noble virtues of self-discipline, personal sacrifice for the greater good, courage in battle, and so on. And the emperor was especially pleased with the political perspective of the Aeneid, in which his reign was in effect regarded as the culmination of Rome's divinely guided rise to world domination. Here we see something like the Roman sculptural equivalent, I think, to Grant Wood's American Gothic. Two stern citizens who seem like the physical embodiment of the ideal Romans of Augustus and Virgil. In a nutshell, the Aeneid tells the story of Aeneas, who fled Troy after its fall, had an affair with Queen Dido of Carthage, and then went on to achieve his predestined purpose, the founding of Roman civilization in Latium. It became one of the most influential works of literature ever written, and was much admired all through the Christian Middle Ages. We don't have time to go into this now, but next quarter we'll hear how the Christian writers of the Middle Ages often regarded classical heroes, especially of the era of Augustus in which Christ was born, as just too impressive to leave out of the Christian fold altogether. Virgil and even Augustus himself were often regarded as not much different from Isaiah and Solomon. I should also mention Horace, because he was a good friend of Virgil, who introduced him to Maecenas, who then also undertook his support, and his odes are considered by many the finest things of their kind ever written. This is a portrait of Cicero, about whom we heard because of his part in the civil war following the assassination of Caesar. As a writer, he is still regarded as the great master of Latin prose style, especially in his many surviving speeches, but many of the other things he wrote are more entertaining to a modern reader. His letters to his friend Atticus, some 800 of which survive, are a tremendous source of information regarding the politics, thought, and general nature of life in Rome in his day. Publius Ovidius Naso, known as Ovid, is another very important writer of the Golden Age. His book, The Metamorphoses, became the main source of information about classical mythology throughout virtually the entire history of Western art. Along with the Bible and the Golden Legend, it should be must-reading for anyone interested in this subject. Luckily for Ovid and for us, he managed to finish this before he was suddenly banished by Augustus to Romania for still unknown reasons. Ovid himself says this was because his Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was found offensive by His Majesty, but it has been speculated since antiquity that he had some sort of affair with the emperor's granddaughter Julia, a nymphomaniac by reputation, who was banished to a tiny island in the Adriatic at the same time. In Augustus's day, Titus Livius, known as Livy, wrote a gigantic history of Rome, and even though only about a quarter of it survives, that's still several thousand pages. He's our main source for the legends mixed with history that tell the story of Rome to the time of the Punic Wars, and an important source for everything after that as well, up to about his own lifetime. But the books covering the events with which he was contemporary, from the war between Caesar and Pompey through the reign of Augustus, are lost, and they would probably have been the most valuable of all, since he devoted 100 volumes of the total of 142 to that period. Like Virgil and Horace, he pleased the emperor by his emphasis on what were considered the good old manly Roman virtues, but some think his treatment of his own time was more controversial, and that parts of that treatment might have been published only after the emperor's death, and in such small numbers that their loss is to some extent explained thereby. Augustus died at the age of 77 in 14 AD, and was buried in this tomb near the Tiber. And it wasn't just his tomb. The ashes of many of his Julio-Claudian relatives, as they are called as a family, were placed here also. It bears an interesting similarity to the Etruscan tumuli we saw earlier. Augustus left no son and only one daughter, Julia, by his wife Scribonia. She's usually regarded as his first wife. He may have been, in fact, married after a fashion to another woman before his marriage to Scribonia. The woman then usually regarded as his second wife, Livia, was, according to Will Durant, a model of the old virtues, but one would never guess she was that from reading Robert Graves' I, Claudius. This is a portrait of Livia. In that book, as well as in the Roman historians Suetonius and Tacitus, she comes across as a witch and is accused of various maneuvers to eliminate all those she viewed as rivals of the claims of her own son, Augustus's stepson Tiberius, who did himself marry Augustus's daughter Julia. This is a portrait of Augustus's stepson Tiberius, who was also his son-in-law, and who was 55 at his accession, at which no one batted an eye, so quickly had the Romans fallen back into something like hereditary monarchy. He had been a great general during his stepfather's lifetime, and gets almost nothing but praise from historians until he became emperor, but absolute power seems to have corrupted him absolutely. He fell under the bad influence of, among others, Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the division of the army designated for the immediate protection of the government. This force had always been quartered outside the city, but Sejanus persuaded him to move it inside where it would be ostensibly more effective in time of need, but Sejanus had his own agenda. Gibbon says that moving the Praetorian Guard into the city where it could directly aid or threaten the government was the first step in the decline and fall. Be that as it may, while Tiberius took to wallowing in luxury at coastal resorts, Sejanus acquired more and more control of the capital. Finally, he made an attempt to have Tiberius assassinated, but the plot was foiled and Sejanus himself was executed. This did not, however, shake Tiberius out of his lethargy and self-indulgence. Soon after this, he was apparently smothered with a pillow by a servant who'd been promised something by Caligula, his brother, Tiberius's brother's grandson and the heir apparent. This is a portrait of Caligula, which makes him look as vacant as he was. There's no light on in that house. At first he was popular just because he was the son of the great general Germanicus, the nephew of Tiberius, and then because he made bread and circuses plentiful, but it didn't take him long to degenerate from Caligula the crowd-pleasing emperor to Caligula the cruel clown. He did things like miss the sacrificial animal at a ceremony with his mallet and brain the officiating priest instead. He gave his horse a palace and proposed making him consul. He wallowed in gold and then bathed in perfume. Suetonius simply says Caligula was in fact sick. After 3 years of this, he was assassinated by a group of generals who turned the empire over to his uncle Claudius, whom everyone regarded as a stammering dodo. This is a portrait of Claudius now, and it's difficult to see him today other than through the eyes of Robert Graves, but his books about Claudius are almost pure fiction. Even if it's not altogether inconsistent, what he says with surviving sources, Graves gives us a misleading idea of the amount of information surviving about him when he refers to the 46 chapters, as he puts it, Suetonius devotes to him. True, they're 46 chapters, but they total only 25 pages, out of which Graves makes 800. The truth is probably that he was a conscientious administrator, fundamentally just, and at least a wannabe scholar, despite the fact that Gibbon calls him the stupidest of all the emperors, which is saying a lot. He did order the Claudian aqueduct built, which is the oldest one surviving. This piece is just on the edge of Rome. We'll hear more about these amazing things next quarter. And he made the first permanent Roman establishment in Britain, which he was also the first emperor to visit. Perhaps his main failing was in his judgment of women. At 48, he married the 16-year-old Messalina, who ran off with a gladiator and had to be executed. He then married his niece Agrippina, who had already borne Nero to a previous husband. She persuaded him to disinherit his own son by Messalina and designate her son Nero as his heir. She then poisoned him, and Nero became emperor. Nero's reputation is well enough known. Interpreting his own mother's lust for power as inconsistent with his own, he killed her. He can, I suppose, be called a sort of patron of the arts, but had no talent for anything except self-indulgence. He loved performing in public, often in grandiose spectaculars that drained the treasury. Suetonius says that when he was playing the lyre, singing or acting, no one was allowed to leave the theater, not even pregnant women who were sometimes forced to give birth in the aisles. He says people sometimes pretended to be dead so they could be carried out. He's been accused of starting the disastrous fire of 64 AD so he could rebuild the city and rename it Nero City, Neropolis. Tacitus, in what may be the first non-biblical reference to the new sect, says that he blamed the fire on the Christians and had many crucified. He built a colossal palace, part of which survives near the Colosseum, which was built where its gardens were, but most of it has been in restauro for decades. When he first entered it and gazed around at all the marble and gold and servants, he gushed, "Ah, at last I can live like a human being." Seneca was his tutor and is considered the most important of all Roman dramatists, but his work is rarely performed now outside classics departments. He and the poet Lucan were forced to commit suicide after being accused of plotting to have Nero assassinated. In fact, his behavior soon led to a flurry of such plots. When the Senate heard that the army of the General Galba was on the way from Spain to get rid of him, it bribed the Praetorian Guard to look the other way, and Nero was forced to run for his life with nothing but the clothes on his back, and he also apparently then committed suicide, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 68 AD. Galba was himself assassinated by the Praetorians within the year, and his successor Otho committed suicide 3 months later after being defeated by the army of his successor Vitellius, who was overthrown when the man you see here, Vespasian, arrived with his army to put an end to this game of musical thrones in 69 AD, known as the Year of the Three Emperors. It's amazing that there could be emperors like Caligula and Nero, and such chaos as occurred in 68 and 69, and the empire survive at all. It's a real tribute to the Roman people as a whole that despite such miserable leadership, things held together until someone like Vespasian, who was strong and effective as a head of state, could emerge again, really for the first time since Augustus had died half a century earlier. According to Durant, he accomplished a miracle of rehabilitation. It was in Vespasian's reign that the most well-known Roman building was erected, the Colosseum, which you see here in the form of a model to give you an idea of its original appearance. Vespasian never lost his sympathy for the common man. He was one himself in origin, and had been raised to the purple by what we might call the democracy of the sword. More and more, the army was to become the electorate. Vespasian's no-nonsense attitude was well illustrated when the Senate proposed to raise funds for a big tomb to honor him after his death. "That's a waste," he said. "Give me the money now, and when I die, just throw my body in the Tiber." The Colosseum was, in fact, apparently ordered built by him over part of Nero's extravagant estate as a political statement to the effect that the people were to come first now. 50,000 men could now be entertained where one had been before. Here you see it as it looks today from the air. The Romans certainly borrowed a lot of architectural ideas from the Greeks, but there's nothing like this in Athens, a freestanding amphitheater, which means round theater. Like many Roman accomplishments, it's as much a triumph of engineering as of art. It was built without mortar, like the aqueducts, and the iron clamps which were used for insurance were melted by the first barbarians to sack the city, and 1,500 years later they still aren't necessary. Here it is at ground level. The stone itself was heavily quarried in the Renaissance for various projects, including St. Peter's, but it was proclaimed a Christian shrine in the 18th century on the assumption that Christians were martyred in it. Gibbon and many others have been skeptical about just how many Christians were really killed here, but I don't think it's unlikely some were. This is the interior as it looks today. Some of the events here must certainly have been spectacular. The floor could apparently even be flooded for battles between ships. This was, of course, a place of very violent entertainment of the kind most of us enjoy in our movies or on TV, video games and so on. The difference is that people in movies, like, say, Gladiator, for example, aren't really getting killed, but I'm not sure that separates us morally from the Romans as much as we might like to think. The Colosseum was finished during the reign of Vespasian's son Titus. Their family name was Flavius, so it is sometimes called the Flavian Amphitheater. This is the arch at the east end of the Forum built in honor of Titus. You'll remember that the Jews were allowed by Cyrus to return home in 539. Alexander the Great overthrew the Persian Empire, and after his death, his general Seleucus took over much of the Near East, including Judea, which, under the Maccabees, revolted against his dynasty. And then in 63 BC, Pompey occupied Jerusalem and made Judea a de facto province. In 66 AD, however, the Jews revolted against Rome in Nero's day, and this revolt was finally suppressed by Titus, in whose reign the temple was destroyed, Masada taken, and the community at Qumran abandoned after the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden. This relief inside the arch shows the Romans carrying off loot from the temple, including the menorah. On August 24th, 79 AD, just after the accession of Titus, the most famous event of his reign occurred when Vesuvius erupted and buried the city of Pompeii south of Naples. The place was essentially forgotten until the 18th century, when workmen began finding artifacts and parts of the ruins. In this aerial view, you can see the site as it looks today. The city had a population of about 20,000, and there were about 2,000 victims, including Pliny the Elder, who was in command of a nearby Roman fleet, and whose scientific curiosity led him to have himself landed on shore, never to be seen again. This is one of the main streets now. There are not many places in the world where you can walk down a street that's 2,000 years old like this. The American historian George Perkins Marsh says that an hour at Pompeii is worth a lifetime devoted to the pages of Livy, which I don't think is quite fair to Livy, but a visit to Pompeii is a memorable experience. Pompeii was in part bustling blue-collar port, but there were also many extensive villas, such as the House of the Faun, of which you see the atrium. Most of the portable art, like the original faun, not a faun like Bambi, a faun like Pan, has been moved to the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. These things have in some cases been replaced at Pompeii by copies. The Battle of Issus mosaic, one of the finest works of art of any kind to survive from the whole of Roman history, was also found in the House of the Faun. It's 16 feet wide and made of 1.5 million marble tesserae. Darius III is being chased off the field by Alexander at the left. Some think this mosaic was actually based on a lost painting by Apelles, the greatest artist of Alexander's own day. This is a detail from it showing Alexander. Marble chips were the Roman mosaic medium of choice for works of art like this. They also used pebbles for outdoors, and the Christians will favor glass, as we'll see next quarter. The suburban estate at Pompeii, called the Villa of the Mysteries, has what are usually considered the finest of all surviving Roman paintings. In fact, thanks to Vesuvius, there are more paintings surviving at Pompeii than from all the rest of the Greek and Roman worlds combined. The paintings are thought to depict some religious, or perhaps it would be better to say Dionysiac ritual, but exactly what's going on is still controversial. They could be scenes from a play. While we see a little more of the Villa of the Mysteries, we'll hear a piece of music arranged by Walter Maioli, whose efforts have been heard before on his CDs for Amiata Records in these lectures. The instrument you'll hear is the tibia duplex, a variety of the Greek aulos or flute. A lyre and a panpipe are being played in this section of the decoration. It is thought that the whole program may have something to do with a premarital initiation, including a ritual flagellation of the bride-to-be to drive out the demon of sterility. The bride, according to this view, would be the kneeling woman at the left. This is a painting of a woman with a lyre from Bosco Reale near Pompeii.
Bosco Reale is just one of several other places around Pompeii which have achieved reincarnation after their burial.
The finest paintings from there, like these, are, however, now in the New York Metropolitan Museum.
The so-called Villa of Poppaea, who was Nero's wife at Oplontis, is also becoming more well known to tourists for its paintings. This one is said to represent Hercules looking for the golden apples of the Hesperides. Getting them was the goal of one of his 12 labors. Herculaneum is taking a long time to uncover because it has been more built over with modern construction. This is the often reproduced mosaic still in situ in the so-called House of Amphitrite and Neptune because they are its subjects. And this is more of the decoration in that room. There is, of course, a lot more to see here, but we don't have time for everything.
So that's where the sun's going to set on the Roman Empire this quarter. Next time we'll begin with the empire at its best in what's sometimes called the century of the good emperors, the 2nd century AD. The decline which follows will officially put the lights out in 476 and the Dark Ages will begin, but a new empire of a sort will arise with the establishment of the Christian Church and its philosophical and artistic ideals. This development will include a series of events of unsurpassed interest, artistic accomplishments of unsurpassed beauty, and personalities of unsurpassed courage, charm, creativity, ignorance, evil, and greatness. Ave atque vale.